The hum of the hospital was a living thing, a low, constant drone that vibrated through the soles of Chloe Davis's worn sneakers. After 11 hours, it felt like it was inside her bones, a permanent thrumming that had replaced her own pulse. The air, thick with the smell of antiseptic and something vaguely like boiled laundry, was a physical weight on her shoulders. She was 20, felt 100, and all she wanted was the sweet, uncomplicated bliss of her lumpy mattress. But the charge nurse, a woman named Carol with exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, had other plans. She cornered Chloe by the nurse's station, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that promised nothing good. The patient in the penthouse suite, the entire floor sealed off by men in sharp suits who didn't smile, had just chased off another nurse. His fourth one. In 2 days. Chloe had heard the whispers, the stories of thrown food trays and terrifying, quiet threats delivered in a language she didn't understand. The patient was Kwon Min-jun, a name that meant nothing to her beyond being a logistical nightmare for the staff. Carol's plea was simple, desperate. Just for the last hour, Chloe. Check his vitals, change the dressing. He won't let anyone else near him. Chloe's mind screamed no. It screamed for her bed, for a cup of lukewarm tea, for the blessed silence of her tiny apartment. But her body, running on the fumes of professional obligation and a deeply ingrained inability to refuse a person in need, simply nodded. She took the chart. The name on the front was an alias, of course, but the notes inside painted a grim picture. 1 gunshot wound to the abdomen, expertly stitched but still high risk for infection, 3 cracked ribs, and extensive bruising. A notation at the bottom, in the attending physician's nervous scrawl, read, "Patient is uncooperative. Highly volatile. Handle with extreme caution." Chloe sighed, the sound lost in the corridor's hum. Caution was a luxury for the well-rested. She was just tired. She pushed the supply cart down the unnervingly silent hallway toward the secured wing, the wheels squeaking a pathetic rhythm against the polished linoleum. 2 guards, built like refrigerators and dressed in identical black suits, stood sentinel before a set of double doors. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched her approach, their eyes as flat and lifeless as polished river stones. This was more than just a rich patient. This was something else entirely. She held up her badge, her hand steady despite the sudden, cold knot forming in her stomach. One of the men nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and unlocked the door. The quiet that met her on the other side was different. It wasn't the quiet of a sleeping hospital, it was the heavy, waiting silence of a predator's den. The air was colder here, filtered and sterile, but underneath it lay a current of something metallic and dangerous. The suite was vast, more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a glittering panorama of the city lights, a universe away from the sterile functionality of the rest of the building. A man sat in a low armchair near the window, his back to her. Another guard stood near the bed, perfectly still. The man in the chair did not turn. Chloe cleared her throat, the sound ridiculously small in the cavernous room. "Mr. Kwon?
I'm Chloe.
I'm your nurse for the next hour. I need to check your vitals and change the dressing on your wound." Silence. The guard by the bed shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes creaking. The man in the chair remained a silhouette against the city. She took a breath, her professionalism a thin shield against the unnerving stillness. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to document your refusal of care." The silhouette finally moved. He turned his head slowly, and the dim light from the city caught the sharp planes of his face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair that fell over his forehead and eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. There was a raw, angry bruise high on his cheekbone, a stark purple against his pale skin. His gaze was not just dismissive, it was utterly contemptuous. He looked through her as if she were a bothersome insect. "Leave the supplies," he said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble, heavily accented but precise. "And get out." Chloe felt a flicker of anger, hot and sharp, cutting through her exhaustion. She had dealt with rude patients, scared patients, grieving patients. This was different. This was arrogance honed to a weapon's edge. She pushed the cart further into the room, the wheels a defiant squeak. "I can't do that, sir. My job is to provide care, and that includes making sure your multi-million-dollar wound doesn't get infected. A ghost of something, annoyance, maybe even surprise, passed over his face before it settled back into a mask of cold indifference. He gestured dismissively toward the door. "You are dismissed." From his perspective, the girl was an anomaly. The others had flinched. They had stammered, their hands shaking as they fumbled with lines and blood pressure cuffs. They had looked at him with a mixture of fear and a cloying, obsequious respect he despised. This one, in her pale blue scrubs that hung loosely on her small frame, just looked tired and annoyed. She didn't look at him like he was Kwon Min-jun, the feared leader of the Golden Dragon Syndicate, a powerful Korean mafia boss whose name silenced rooms. She looked at him like he was an inconvenience at the end of a long day. And for the first time since he'd woken up in this sterile white prison, he felt a sliver of genuine curiosity.
Min-jun, what's it here?
He had built an empire on his ability to read people, to find the cracks in their facades, the hidden fears that could be leveraged. He saw no fear in her. He saw fatigue, yes, a weariness so profound it seemed to settle in her bones. But beneath it, there was a core of something hard and unyielding. She moved with an economy of motion, her hands sure and steady as she laid out fresh gauze, antiseptic wipes, and medical tape on the sterile tray. She didn't look at him again, her focus entirely on the task. This was a challenge. He was a man accustomed to his well-being law. In his world, a glance could end a career, a quiet word could end a life. He decided to test her. "The water they provide," he began, his voice deliberately soft, menacing. "It tastes of plastic. I want mineral water from the French Alps. And it will be cold, not chilled. Cold." The guard by the bed tensed, anticipating the usual capitulation. But Chloe didn't even look up from her work. "The hospital provides filtered water. It's perfectly safe. If you want French mineral water, your assistant can probably have it delivered." She snapped on a pair of latex gloves. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Now, are you going to let me check this dressing, or do you want to add septic shock to your list of complaints?" Min-jun felt a slow, unfamiliar heat creep up his neck. It wasn't anger. It was something else. He was the most powerful Korean mafia boss in the city, and this girl, this child in scrubs, was speaking to him as if he were a toddler throwing a tantrum. He should have had her thrown out. He should have made a call that would ensure she never worked in this city again. But he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He obeyed. He remained silent as she approached the bed, her expression a mask of clinical neutrality. "I need you to lie back, please. And I'll need to lift your shirt." He eased himself onto the bed, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips as his cracked ribs protested. For a fleeting moment, her professional mask slipped. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't pity. It was empathy, a simple human recognition of his pain. It was more disarming than any threat. Her touch was gentle but firm, her fingers surprisingly cool against his feverish skin as she peeled back the old dressing. He watched her face, the way her brows furrowed in concentration, the slight purse of her lips. She worked with a quiet competence that was its own form of authority. "It looks clean," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But there's some inflammation. Have you been moving around too much?" He almost laughed. He had been fighting for his life less than 48 hours ago. Something like that. She cleaned the wound with swift, practiced motions. He flinched when the antiseptic stung, and her hand immediately steadied on his uninjured side. "Almost done," she said, her voice low and calm. It was the first gentle sound he had heard since he arrived. When she finished applying the new dressing, she disposed of the old materials with the same methodical efficiency. She made notes in his chart, her handwriting small and neat. She was all business. And yet, he felt the tension in the room had shifted. It was no longer a standoff. It was a space occupied by two people, a fragile truce declared in the language of sterile gauze and quiet competence. The late hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing shifts of the guards outside his door. After that first encounter, Minjun had issued a single, quiet order. She was to be his only nurse. The hospital administration, relieved, had readily agreed. So Chloe became a fixture in the quiet, tense world of the penthouse suite. She would arrive, her face etched with the familiar lines of fatigue, and a strange sort of calm would settle over him. He found himself waiting for the sound of her squeaking cart, the soft click of the door. He told himself it was because she was competent. She was the only one who didn't treat him like a porcelain doll or a caged tiger. She treated him like a patient. A difficult, demanding patient, but a patient nonetheless. One night, the pain in his side was a hot, relentless fire that made sleep impossible. He was sitting in the armchair again, staring out at the indifferent city lights, when she entered for her final rounds. She moved quietly, assuming he was asleep. He watched her check the monitors, her movements fluid and practiced in the dim light. She paused by his chart, her pen scratching softly in the silence. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice raspy. She startled a small, sharp intake of breath. "You should be, too. Does the pain medication not work? It dulls the edges. It doesn't put out the fire." He didn't know why he'd told her that. Admitting to weakness was a fatal flaw in his world. But with her, the words just came. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply studied him for a long moment. Sometimes a distraction works better than morphine. She pulled a chair from the corner and sat a respectful distance away. "Tell me something that isn't about this hospital room." The question was so unexpected, so normal. No one asked him questions like that. They took orders. They gave reports. They feared him. They didn't make small talk. "What do you want to know?" "I don't know. What's the first thing you're going to eat when you get out of here?" "It can't be this hospital food." A small, genuine smile touched his lips. It felt like a foreign expression.
Jiggy.
"My grandmother's recipe. So spicy it makes your eyes water. Sounds better than Jell-O," she said, her own lips curving slightly. "Are you a student?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "I work full-time here. I take classes on my days off. Trying to finish my bachelor's. Why nursing?" The question hung in the air between them. She looked down at her hands, then back at him, her gaze direct. "Because things break. And I'm good at putting them back together. Or, at least, patching them up so they can heal on their own." He felt that statement in his cracked ribs, in the stitched-together flesh of his abdomen. He was a broken thing, and this tired girl in blue scrubs was patching him up. The intimacy of the moment was more potent than any physical touch. It was a quiet conversation in a dark room, a tiny island of humanity in the cold, sterile sea of his life. For the first time, he saw past the uniform. He saw Chloe. And he realized, with a jolt that had nothing to do with his injuries, that he wanted to see more. The fragile peace of their late-night routine was shattered by the arrival of 3 men. They were not his usual guards. These men wore suits that were sharper, their faces harder. They carried themselves with the chilling stillness of apex predators. They bowed deeply to Minjun, but their eyes, cold and assessing, flickered over Chloe as she was preparing an 4-drip.
Minun's demeanor changed instantly.
The quiet, contemplative patient disappeared, replaced by the formidable Korean Mafia boss she had only glimpsed before. His posture straightened, his voice dropped to that low, commanding tone, and he switched to Korean, the words rapid and sharp. Chloe didn't understand the language, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of strategy, of violence, of a world governed by brutal rules she couldn't begin to comprehend. She tried to make herself invisible, focusing on the transparent tube of the 4, flushing the line, her movements precise and automatic. But she couldn't block out the sound. She heard a name repeated several times, the Viper, followed by a guttural word that sounded like betrayal. One of the men gestured angrily, his voice rising, and Minjun silenced him with a single, slicing motion of his hand. The room fell silent. The tension was a physical presence, pressing in on her, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The men were discussing business. Mafia business. And she was a witness. A civilian who had stumbled into the heart of the beast. The tallest of the 3 men, the one with a long, thin scar bisecting his eyebrow, finally looked at Minjun and then pointedly at her. He said something in Korean, a question. Minjun's answer was short, dismissive. But the man with the scar continued to stare at Chloe, his expression unreadable, and a cold dread trickled down her spine. They knew she was there. They knew she was listening. In their world, what happened to witnesses? She finished her task, her hands miraculously steady. "The four is ready," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the charged silence. Minjun nodded, his eyes still locked with the scarred man's. "You may go." It was a dismissal, but it felt like a reprieve. She gathered her things and walked towards the door, feeling the weight of their gazes on her back. Just as she reached for the handle, she heard Minjun speak again, this time in English, his voice like chips of ice. "She is with me. Do not look at her again." The words were a shield, a claim. She didn't dare turn around. She just slipped out of the room, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving her alone in the silent, empty hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The danger she had intellectually understood was now a visceral reality. It wasn't just a label attached to a difficult patient. It was real, it was in that room, and for some terrifying reason, she had just been placed under its protection. That night, his fever spiked. The inflammation around the wound, aggravated by the stress of the meeting, had turned angry and red. Chloe was called back just as her shift was ending. When she entered the room, Minjun was thrashing against the sheets, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was delirious, muttering in Korean, his eyes unfocused. The guards looked on, helpless and alarmed. "Get me a cooling blanket and a basin of lukewarm water," she commanded, her voice cutting through their panic. They scrambled to obey. She approached the bed cautiously. He was strong, even weakened by injury and fever. As she reached to check his forehead, his hand shot out and clamped around her wrist. His grip was surprisingly powerful, a desperate, clutching hold that wasn't meant to harm but to anchor. "Gajima," he rasped, his eyes finding hers, a flicker of terrified recognition in their feverish depths. "Please don't go." The plea, raw and stripped of all his usual authority, struck her to the core. This was not the untouchable Mafia boss. This was a man in pain, terrified of being alone. She gently placed her free hand over his. "I'm not going anywhere, Minjun. I'm right here." The use of his given name seemed to calm him. His grip loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. She worked around his hold, sponging his face and neck with the cool water, speaking to him in a low, soothing murmur. She told him about her day, about a funny thing a patient in another ward had said, about the traffic on the way to work. Pointless, mundane things that were the antithesis of his violent world. She talked to fill the silence, to give him a voice to focus on other than the one in his fevered mind. For hours, she sat by his bed, her wrist held captive in his hand. She monitored his temperature, administered the antibiotics the doctor prescribed, and kept wiping away the sweat that beaded on his brow. The guards faded into the background, silent witnesses to this strange, intimate tableau. At some point, deep in the night, his fever broke. The tension left his body, and his breathing evened out into the slow, deep rhythm of true sleep. His hand finally went slack, releasing her. Chloe sat there for a long time, watching him. The faint light of dawn was beginning to creep through the windows, painting the room in soft shades of gray. Her wrist was red and sore where he had held her, a physical reminder of the night's events. The professional lines she had so carefully drawn had been irrevocably erased. She had seen the man behind the monster, the vulnerable human being beneath the layers of power and fear. And a terrifying, unwanted warmth spread through her chest. It felt a lot like compassion, but she was afraid it might be something more. She knew she should leave. Her shift had ended hours ago. But she couldn't bring herself to go. She simply stayed, watching over the sleeping Korean Mafia boss as the city woke up below. The attack came with the morning coffee cart. It was brutally simple, brutally audacious. A man dressed in orderly scrubs, pushing a cart laden with thermoses and pastries, bypassed the guards with a nod and a doctored ID badge. He was new, he said, just filling in. The guards, lulled by the routine of the hospital, let him pass. Chloe was in the room, checking Minjun's vitals. He was awake, lucid, the fever gone, leaving him weak but clear-eyed. They were talking, or rather, she was talking, telling him his temperature was normal, and he was listening with that unnerving stillness of his. When the door opened, the orderly entered, a sickeningly cheerful smile on his face. "Coffee?" he asked. Chloe opened her mouth to say they hadn't ordered any, but Minjun moved first. Despite his injuries, he lunged across the bed, shoving her behind him with a force that sent her stumbling against the far wall. The world seemed to slow down, to warp. The orderly's smile vanished. His hand, which had been reaching for a thermos, instead pulled a long, thin knife from beneath a stack of napkins. In the hallway, there was a sudden shout, a heavy thud. The guards had realized their mistake. The man with the knife ignored the commotion. His eyes were fixed on Minjun, who now stood between him and the bed, a human shield. Minjun was unarmed, injured, wearing nothing but hospital-issued pajamas. But the sheer force of his presence, the absolute murderous intent in his eyes, made the assassin hesitate for a fatal second. That was all his guards needed. The door burst open. The fight was short, savage, and almost silent. It wasn't a brawl, it was a lethal ballet of violence. Chloe saw a flash of steel, heard a choked gasp, and then the assassin was on the floor, a pool of dark red spreading rapidly across the pristine white linoleum. It was over. Minjun sagged against the bed, his hand pressed to his side, his face ashen with pain and exertion. Chloe's training kicked in, a blessed wave of adrenaline that washed away the paralyzing fear. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She moved. First, she slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. Then she shoved the heavy armchair against it, wedging it under the handle. Only then did she rush to Minjun's side. "Are you hurt? Did you reopen the wound?" He shook his head, breathing in ragged gasps. "Check the hall." She peered through the peephole. His two guards were standing over the body, weapons now drawn, speaking urgently into their phones. The immediate threat was neutralized. She turned back to Minjun. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a stunned, raw emotion she had never seen before. He wasn't looking at his wound. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at her. He had seen her barricade the room. He had seen her move not with panic, but with purpose. In the moment of crisis, she had not cowered. She had protected their space. She had protected him. The professional relationship was a ruin, burned to the ground in a few seconds of brutal violence. In its place was something else, something terrifying and undeniable, forged in the heat of shared danger. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. The body was gone, the hallway was secured, and the hospital was swarming with a new set of serious men in suits who spoke quietly to the police. But inside the room, an invisible perimeter had been drawn. It was just the two of them, cocooned in the aftermath. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sharp scent of adrenaline. Chloe had cleaned a small cut on Minjun's arm, her hands moving on autopilot. Now, she sat in the chair she had pulled over hours before, a universe ago, and watched him. He hadn't spoken a word since the attack. He just lay back against the pillows, his eyes closed, his breathing still labored. She thought he might have fallen asleep, but then he spoke, his voice a low rasp. "You did not run, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of awe." "I'm a nurse," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her. "My job is to stay. That is not your job," he said, his eyes opening. They were dark, intense, and fixed on her with a gravity that pulled all the air from her lungs. "Your job is to dispense medicine and change bandages. Your job is not to barricade a door against assassins." He pushed himself up, ignoring the pain that action must have cost him. He was no longer looking at her like a patient or an employee or even a curiosity. He was looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to kill him. "For the past 3 years," he began, his voice deliberate, each word carefully chosen, "my life has been a series of calculations, risks and rewards. loyalty, and betrayal. It is all noise. A game played with ghosts. Nothing is real. He paused, and his gaze swept over her face, her tired eyes, the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. Until the confession was so simple, so direct, it was more devastating than any poem. You walk in here, exhausted, unafraid, and you tell me the hospital water is good enough. You put a bandage on a gunshot wound like you're fixing a scraped knee. You sit in the dark and talk about food. You do not run when a man with a knife is in the room. You are real. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them before gently, tentatively, touching her cheek. His fingers were calloused, but his touch was surprisingly soft. I think, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, that I have been waiting for something real for a very long time. Chloe's heart, which had been pounding with fear, now pounded with something else entirely. Something more dangerous. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. She just sat there, captured by the raw, vulnerable sincerity in the eyes of the most dangerous man she had ever met. The Korean Mafia boss had just laid his heart, or whatever brutal equivalent he possessed, at her feet. He was being discharged the next day. The hospital, eager to be rid of the liability and the army of guards that now patrolled its halls, had expedited everything. The official story was a gas leak in the VIP wing. The truth was a quiet, bloody affair that had been scrubbed from the records. Chloe came for her final shift, her stomach in a tight, anxious knot. The room was different. The medical equipment was gone. Minjun was dressed not in pajamas, but in a perfectly tailored dark suit that made him look impossibly formidable, even with the faint lines of pain still etched around his eyes. His guards were packing a small bag. The air crackled with the energy of departure. He was leaving. He was going back to his world of violence and betrayal, and she was going back to her world of 12-hour shifts and lukewarm tea. The thought left a hollow ache in her chest. He dismissed his men with a flick of his wrist. They melted out of the room, leaving them alone one last time. They are still out there, he said, his voice flat. The ones who sent him. This is not over, Chloe nodded, her throat too tight to speak. You are not safe here anymore, he continued. They saw you. They saw me to protect you. In their eyes, you are now a liability. Or a weakness. The cold, hard logic of his world was terrifying. She had simply been doing her job, and it had marked her as a target. What am I supposed to do? She whispered. You have two choices, he said, walking towards her. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You can go back to your life. I will have my men watch you, from a distance. They will be discreet. But it is a risk. I cannot guarantee they will always be there in time. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. Or, you can come with me. The offer hung in the air, a shocking, impossible proposition. Come with you? By my side, you would be untouchable. The most protected person in this city. No one would dare to harm you. As what? She asked, the question sharp. Your nurse? A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his face.
No.
Not as my nurse. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, laying himself bare. As mine. I know what my world is. It is ugly, and it is violent. I would not blame you for choosing to run from it. But I am asking you not to. I am asking you to choose me. It was an insane choice. Her life was simple, safe, planned. Work, school, sleep, repeat. His was a dark, glittering world of unimaginable wealth and unspeakable violence. Choosing him meant abandoning everything she knew, everything she was working towards. It meant stepping into the shadows. But as she looked at him, at the quiet desperation in his eyes, she realized the truth. Her simple, safe life had started to feel gray and empty from the moment he had entered it. With him, she had felt more alive, more present than she had in years. He was a storm, and she had spent her whole life in the quiet before it. She took a breath, the sterile hospital air filling her lungs for what felt like the last time. Her entire future balanced on the edge of this single moment, this single word. The logical part of her brain, the part that had gotten her through nursing school and grueling shifts, was screaming at her to run. To say no, thank you, and walk back into the predictable safety of her life. A life where the greatest danger was a needle stick or a patient falling out of bed. But her heart, that foolish, stubborn organ, was telling a different story. It was remembering the quiet vulnerability in his eyes during his fever, the desperate way he'd held her hand, the raw honesty of his confession in the aftermath of the attack. He was a monster to the world, a powerful mafia boss wrapped in violence, but to her, he had shown a side he showed to no one else. He had shown her the man. "If I come with you," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "what happens to me? To my life?" "You will have a new life," he answered, his voice laced with a fierce, possessive promise. "Anything you want, it will be yours. But you will not be a nurse. You will not work. Your only concern will be to stay by my side." It was a cage, a beautiful, gilded cage. But staying here, knowing his enemies might find her, was its own kind of prison, one built of fear. At least in his cage, she would have him. "Okay," she whispered. The word was so small, yet it changed everything. A profound relief washed over Minjun's face, so powerful it was like watching a mask crack. For the first time, she saw him not as a patient or a predator, but as a man who had been terrified of her answer. He simply nodded, a gesture of solemn finality. An hour later, she was walking out of the hospital, not through the main entrance, but through a private service exit leading to an underground garage. She wasn't wearing her light blue scrubs anymore. One of his men had delivered a bag containing a simple black dress, soft leather shoes, and a dark wool coat. Her old life was literally shed, left behind in a locker. The garage was dim, smelling of concrete and exhaust fumes. A sleek black sedan waited, its engine purring softly. One of the guards opened the back door for her. Minjun was inside, waiting. She slid in beside him, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud, sealing them in. The car began to move, gliding silently up the ramp and into the gray light of the city. He didn't speak, but he reached over and took her hand. His grasp was warm, firm, a silent contract. She looked at their joined hands, his, large and calloused, bearing the faint scars of a violent life, hers, smaller, a nurse's hands. They made no sense together, and yet they felt right. "There will be rules," he said finally, looking at her, his expression serious. "Things you will need to learn to be safe," she just nodded. "There is one more thing," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "This is not a temporary arrangement. You are not a guest in my life. You are its center. I will make you my wife, Chloe." It wasn't a proposal. It was a statement of fact, a declaration. The young black nurse who had broken the rules was now bound to the Korean mafia boss who made them. As the car merged into the relentless flow of city traffic, she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the familiar world slip away. She was terrified. But as she felt the steady pressure of his hand in hers, she also felt a fragile, dangerous sense of hope. She was no longer just patching up a broken man. She was stepping into his broken world to build something new together.